It's another aspect of what I meant by what divine pathos and not just any pathos. If divine caring is interpreted in excessively anthropopathic terms, if it's just human, then, paradoxically, it's no longer God who cares. In order for God to care, the care has to be different than my care. That's the paradox, or the dialectic. So the tenuous balance you have to constantly strike between the unavoidable employment of human language on one side and the necessarily vigilant awareness of its inadequacy on the other. So source 22, he says, the greatest challenge to the biblical language was how to reconcile in words the awareness of God's transcendence with his overwhelming livingness and concern. The prophets, in other words, had no alternative but, quote, to use anthropomorphic language in order to convey non-anthropomorphic being. They used human language to describe a God they didn't think of as human. And here Heschel says something that I want to end with, because I think it's like startlingly beautiful and it's very easy to miss. I might have alluded to this in one of the first lectures. If you think having concern for every abandoned widow and orphan in history and loving every human being in the history of the world is anthropomorphism, show me the guy you're talking about. Show me that human being. When the prophets speak of God's pathos, what is being evoked is something decidedly not human. Source 23. The idea of the divine pathos combining absolute selflessness with supreme concern for the poor and the exploited can hardly be regarded as the attribution of human characteristic. Where's the man who was endowed with such characteristics? And then wonderfully, with great wryness in source 24, the belief that ultimately there is a God who's concerned for justice is anthropomorphic in the sense in which the idea of transcendence or eternity is anthropomorphic. Right? Show me that person. You want to say that it's anthropomorphism to talk about deep, abiding, and utterly present love for all the forgotten as a projection of humanity onto God? The opposite is the case, and that's source 25. God's unconditional concern for justice is not an anthropomorphism. Rather, man's concern for justice is a theomorphism, meaning, right, what we have is the opportunity at moments to rise to the level of, in small ways, participating in and reflecting divine justice and pathos. Okay, stop there. Take some thoughts. Pencil so I can write down questions. And maybe we'll stop a little early because some of you can't resist hearing Wolf Blitzer's voice. CNN is now ready to call, what is it? Yeah.
So it's not clear to me that Heschel is doing any methodology different from Maimonides, because he's going to say that God has anger, but God's anger is not like our anger. Like, I don't understand that. I don't see that he has any kind of different methodology.
Okay, let me take a couple of more comments. Yeah, I didn't see.
I'm wondering, so going back to the first lecture on wonder, this idea of like wonder and us, almost like that wonder, I think you were explaining, points us to God, like in this, the relationship between wonder and God and humans having this wonder, and I'm wondering how that plays into God's the relationship between the two.
Okay, let's take one more. I'm not taking good enough notes on these questions, I'm going to lose them, but I'm going to try. Steve, yeah.
What would Heschel's response be to, in this line of argument to Moshe talking God out of destroying the Jewish people when he gets angry? And also, what would he say about David, I think it's Blumenthal's abuse of God theory, ideas?
Good, okay. So first, is his methodology different than Maimonides? Well, yes and no, right? Yes, in that he still believes that he has found a way to talk about love, care, relatedness, covenant. No, in that, let me say it in this way. Heschel allows philosophical concerns to sophisticate his theology more than he will admit when discussing his method. Meaning, and I just use sophisticate as a verb, but it is actually a verb, which is weird. And I don't know how else to say it, to render more sophisticated. In other words, maybe it's a useful way to say here, there are two attacks on Heschel that are mirrors of each other. Eliezer Berkovitz, in a notoriously kind of vituperative attack on Heschel, says, Heschel is really no more than a literalist about divine emotions, and by the way, he's also pretty close to a Christian. Eliezer Berkovitz was a very significant thinker in his own right, but a startlingly ungenerous reader of people with whom he disagreed. It's just a very interesting kind of piece of his intellectual project. It's one pole, right? That's, by the way, just demonstrably untrue, meaning Heschel was extremely preoccupied with. You can say he was unsuccessful at, but he was extremely concerned with dealing with the charge of literalism. In fact, he spends much of the prophets trying to deal with exactly that. On the other pole, Terence Fretheim, prominent biblical theologian who's come up in my class on Genesis, basically says, Heschel, you say things that are so inspiring as reading of the Bible, but where did you get the idea that the God of the Bible has some essence that is not his pathos? In other words, Berkovitz says, you haven't read enough Maimonides. And Fretheim says, you've read too much Maimonides. Right? I mean, neither one of them says it like that, but right, that's essentially what they're saying, right? Berkovitz basically says, if you took Maimonides more seriously, you would not talk about pathos the way you talk about it. And Fretheim says, if you just took the Bible seriously and didn't allow yourself to be infected by philosophy, you would talk about pathos is essence. There's no God who is sort of like, there's an essence of God that is separate from the pathos of God. Where does the Bible say that? So Heschel would say, where does the Bible say that? That's what it means when it says, Kilo machshavotay machshavoteitem. Right? Your thoughts are not my thoughts. Oshikein shalom. I'm, not a scholar of Isaiah. So I think what's important to say is he definitely thinks he's doing something very different from Maimonides, and he is. The question is whether the ways that he kind of deliteralizes is too much Maimonidean or too little Maimonidean. And that will depend a little bit on where you stand on this question, both on how you think philosophically and on how you think people should read Scripture. Those two concerns are totally intertwined. Because how you think philosophically will necessarily affect how you read Scripture. Right? I mean, that's sort of an obvious point. But if you're like a Kabbalistic pantheist, you're going to read Genesis 1 to be saying things, you're going to say some really extreme things that do violence to the literal meaning of the text. You have no choice but to do that. Right? If you're Maimonides, you're going to do equal violence, or maybe even, whatever, more violence in certain ways to Genesis 1, or any other text. Okay, that's a little bit of a rambling answer to you, but I think it gets at the issue, and you ask something that Heschel is kind of hit at from both sides. Now, what's the relationship between wonder and God-seeking humans? If I understood you, Becca, correctly, I think that, and this goes to actually all three of these lectures now, right? If wonder for Heschel, going back to that first lecture, has this kind of component of a sense that something is asked of us, God in search of man is the kind of metaphysical correlate to that intuition. We intuit that something is asked of us, and lo and behold, there is a God who is asking something of us. In other words, there's a correlation between a human experience and a metaphysical truth. By the way, there's a parallel to that in Man is Not Alone that is totally beautiful and that people don't often pay attention to. And I think in some ways it's even more powerful psychologically. Man is not alone if you kind of if you force Heschel to have a thread that goes all the way through it. Right? The essential argument is, look, what do human beings most need? To be needed. And what do they need to be needed by? Something that is ultimate and not transient. Interesting. What does Revelation tell us? Human beings are needed by the creator of heaven and earth. There's a human hunger and a metaphysical truth that are totally intertwined. Now, if you're a skeptic about religious tradition, you'll say, well, isn't that convenient? Right? But just because it's beautiful doesn't mean it's false, any more than just because it's beautiful doesn't mean it's true. Right? That's the sort of the sort of Freudian Feuerbachian sort of mistake traditional religious thinkers would say is, yeah, some things you want to be true and they are true. Right? I mean, the fact that Freud in his good, I'm sorry, now I'm wandering totally here, but Freud in his good moments is very careful in this way. It's why he talks about religion as an illusion, not a delusion. Because an illusion simply means the reason I believe it is because I want it to be true. A delusion is a claim, I believe it because I want it to be true and it is false. Freud happens to think it's a delusion, but he's careful in many of his writings to call it an illusion, because he knows he can't actually demonstrate that it's a delusion. He can just, in his letters, make fun of anyone who would be stupid enough to believe it. But that's a different conversation. Now, Moshe talking God out of God's anger. So I want to make one observation, Steve, about Moshe in Heschel's work that I find somewhat mystifying. Heschel's not very interested in Moshe. It's very weird, right? For a guy, for a thinker who is all about prophetic theology, prophets are Nevi'im Achronim. They are the later prophets. Hosea, Isaiah, Amos. It's not Moshe. Now, how Heschel read those passages? Well, here's the thing. Heschel doesn't spend a lot of time on Chumash. There are passages in Chumash that he loves, and there are large swaths of Chumash that he's not particularly preoccupied with. I don't exactly know how to explain that. That is not a passage that's convenient to him. It is also the case, by the way, that the prophet who most develops in some ways that Heschel would have found undoubtedly disturbing, the notion of a God who is very self-concerned, is Ezekiel, who is reduced at times to appealing to God not to harm Israel because it'll look bad for him. And those arguments seem to work. Right? This is Israeli Bible scholar Baruch Schwartz has written about this, right? You know, Ezekiel's God is not all transitive concern. Well, lo and behold, there's another reason that when Heschel writes a book on the prophets, there's no chapter on Ezekiel. Everybody gets their own chapter. All the boys get a chapter. Isaiah, Jeremiah, 2nd Isaiah, right? We start going, Ezekiel, he's not in there.
He just doesn't go to chapter.
Yeah, fine. It's also because Heschel wants to argue against the view that prophets were mentally ill. And Ezekiel's a harder case to make. Because some wild stuff is going on there, right? And it's a harder, if you're busy arguing against sort of like medical reductionism, you don't want to write about a guy who seems like some of his visions might be epileptic seizures, right? You don't want to do that. So Ezekiel becomes, he's the guy, you know, sort of he's the weird one anyway. Being a little flip, but that's, okay. Let me take 2 more questions that I will skillfully evade, and then we're going to go home. Eric, you going to be on TV tonight?
No report.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
I have 2 things. One, is there a match where I understand what seems to be a connection or like, sort of like the same thing that is like the divine pathos and the fact that God needs man? Like it seems to be the same thing for Heschel, or very connected.
And you don't see that they're connected?
I'm not sure that I'm able to articulate how they're
Good.
connected.
It's a great question. Okay.
That's one thing, and the other thing is that when you're talking, or Heschel was talking about the fact that God's emotions are a consequence of choice, a result of choice, like God is choosing to, and humans are not, are like controlled by their emotions. I wonder, like personally, how much we as humans can like try to be godlike in the sense of choosing our
Good. Okay. Yes. Very interesting. Okay. What? Yeah. Please.
I'll keep it to one question. I think you spoke very profoundly about the idea that God makes space for human beings. I mean, that's part of the relationship. So, and then right after that, I don't know, you talked about redemption. And so, you know, God kind of takes a step back and doesn't exercise God's powers to redeem the world, I think to allow us the space to work on smaller scale problems that of course we can't accomplish the entire thing. But then why does God want to redeem the world? Wouldn't that demolish the relationship?
Great. Okay. So, Tila's first question, God who needs man and divine pathos. You know, Heschel says at one point, I think it's not on the packet that I gave you, I think I did not include it. He says at one point that divine pathos is merely the implication of the notion of God in need of man. And that's what you're calling into question. Is that really true? And I think what he would say is, and here again, you can sort of hear Maimonides in the background saying, would you stop making these analogies between people and God, right? But I think what he would say is, well, if you really feel that you need something, or someone, more powerfully, aren't you by definition vulnerable to the possibility that you won't get it? Or have them respond to you? If you reach out to someone in a genuinely relational way, and they turn away from you, almost by definition, doesn't that entail being hurt? Otherwise, it's not a genuine reaching out, right? Reaching out to someone. I mean, now let's go from the divine to the merely crude. You've been wanting to ask someone on a date for a long time. You call them up, and they say, I really think we should just be friends. And you feel the knife, right? And he says that emotional experience there's a divine version of that. And why am I saying that kind of sort of ridiculous example? Is because the gesture towards relationality makes me vulnerable. If there was no possibility of divine pathos, there would be no genuine gesture of relationality. That's the emotional assumption, I think. And let's put it this way. About humans, I think that's obviously true. Whether we should always make this leap from the human to the divine in the way that he does is a good question. It's the question in a certain way that you can levy here. But I think that's how he would respond to the challenge that you are raising, is it really is an implication. It's an emotional implication. If I'm really going to talk about caring, then I have to talk about caring. And caring is risking. One of the things it's risking is actually being disappointed. Now, can we too aspire to control our emotions? Well, Heschel basically says yes, although not in, he does not want a sort of automaton that says, I don't feel things unless I decide to. But he is very clear. He says, I think it's actually very moving. He says that one of the distinctions, and again, if you're a historian, you will immediately point out, yes, anytime someone makes these kind of dramatic typologies, this is Greek thinking, this is Hebrew thinking, they're always oversimplifying by definition. But one of the things he's going to say is that Greek thinking privileged the intellect to such a degree that it made no space for emotions. And that the ideal Greek philosophical man is what he calls homo apathetikos, right? The man who feels nothing. In contrast, he says, what biblical anthropology, the biblical conception of the human, is not about human beings transcending feelings, but directing them. Which is a form of what you're talking about. It's not about deciding whether I feel certain things, but it is about trying to direct the things I feel it about. Right? There are always going to be things that ideally excite passion in me. But is it going to be, making sure I get this week's copy of the National Enquirer in time? Or is it about things that actually matter? So and it's very, very important to him. It's one of the things he says. He says, one of the reasons why Greek philosophy, as he's understanding it, can't make sense of the God of the Hebrew Bible is, how could you attribute something as base as emotions to something transcendent as God? He says, but I reject that premise out of hand. The Bible simply does not share the view that emotions are something to be embarrassed by. What we're not supposed to be is slave to emotions. And that there becomes a spiritual life. And that's what it means, also, any good virtue theorist, right, forget about religion for a minute, will tell you part of what it means to cultivate virtue is not to transcend having feelings, but to cultivate a certain set of feelings and to direct them in a particular direction. Now, I want to say maybe here, because it's actually useful to point this out. See, I think that one of Heschel's worries is, and this is, I think, a very interesting thing to just contemplate. I'll just sort of throw this out, and people can sort of play with this in the back of your mind. I'm happy to talk to you about this in the coming days. I think that one of Heschel's biggest anxieties is he believes that the way you imagine God cannot but have implications for the way you imagine what an ideal human being looks like. And one of his great concerns is that in the 20th century, in a time when indifference has ruled the day, to worship the Greek God who is indifferent is actually to make a metaphysics out of exactly what's wrong with people. Oh, not only are we indifferent, but we worship indifference. And in contrast, the God of the Bible, a God who cares, can't but elicit. And this is a big ideally needs to be said here, right? Can't but elicit human care. Because on some level, you aspire to be some paltry reflection of that which you worship. By the way, Heschel would have taken great comfort in his argument in that one prominent scholar of Maimonides actually says, Maimonides' human ideal is a human being who has totally transcended emotions. Now, I think that person is wrong in his reading of Maimonides, but I think Heschel would have said, no, but that's what I'm talking about. The very possibility that you would entertain that view is exactly what worries me. See, another way of saying it is Maimonides and Heschel have two fundamentally different fights, which is a way of thinking why they're so different. Maimonides' problem is idolatry. Heschel's problem is indifference. And it leads you to two totally different places. Right? The problem is idolatry. You're going to spend your time, or at least in a particular kind of philosophical milieu, you're going to spend your time trying to purify your notion of God. The problem is indifference. You're going to try to restore a God who actually gives a damn. Right? Now, it doesn't mean that you're just making up metaphysical claims because you want to cultivate a certain kind of humanity. But it does mean that the metaphysical claims you make will lead to cultivating a certain vision of humanity. Now, that question is really, really hard. The last thing I want to say. Oh, I didn't talk about David Blumenthal. I will talk about him next week a little bit. Why does God want to redeem the world? Doesn't that end the relationship? All I would say about that is, I think that Jewish tradition gives voice, not in the words you just used, but de facto says what you just said all the time. What does it mean when, on the one hand, rabbinic sources dream about a world in which everything has been fixed and we're free to sit contemplating God? I'm kind of Maimonidizing Chazal there for a minute, but okay. It's rather a historical thing to do, but for the point I'm making, it's fine. And at the same time say, yeah, and you know what? One day of struggling in Olam Hazeh is worth more than all of that. It's saying those two things. On the one hand, we want to live in a place, in a space that is already perfected. On the other hand, if we live in a space that's already perfected, where's growth? If there's no growth, what's the point? Which is why I think there's some ambivalence about, have you ever thought about this? Look, on one level, it may just be a basic human feeling of loss. But why do people find it so troubling when other people say, oh, about someone who died, oh, they're in a better place now? Now, there are many reasons why you might find that upsetting. But one of the things I think is just interesting about that is that I think on one level, there's a Jewish tradition that says, that's actually true. And there's another strand of the Jewish tradition that says, I'm not so sure that's true. Because one of the problems of Olam Haba is that it's filled with stasis. Everything is the way it is. And Olam Hazeh is all about dynamism. Right? It's actually about growing towards. So that is, I think, the way Chazal expressed the anxiety that you're expressing. Right? And so, why would God want to redeem the world? It seems like God has two dreams. Right? One is a world that is perfect, and another is a world in which human beings respond relationally to God's call. The dream of Tanakh and of Jewish theology is that those two things can happen together. And the tragedy in Tanakh is, and certainly in Chazal, is the feeling of, oh yeah, empirically speaking, we're not doing so good, right? And so that's the tension. Maybe I'll say it one other way. There are two very deep human yearnings. One is to live in a world in which Umacha Hashem Dima Me'al Kol Panim, right? In which tears have been obliterated. And the other is to live in a world in which every day human beings are growing towards God. The question is that you're really asking is, can you have both of those things? It isn't clear that you can. It isn't clear that you can, which is why you have, as always in Judaism, right, these like voices living uneasily together rather than just crowding each other out. Okay, thank you all very much.